Yeah?
Okay.
Good? Yeah.
I'm gonna run there and just give me just have a conversation really quick.
Okay.
Then just
Okay. Excellent. Just to remind you all, when our speakers are up here, they can be maskless, but while you're in this room, it's a classroom and Yale's regulations require you to be masked while you're here. And I think, given recent numbers, this is for everybody's well-being. So first of all, I want to thank Angelica Gallegos, a member of the class of 2021, for the creation of the map on the screen here. This is, since we are visual people, our tribal lands acknowledgement, which you can also find on the school's website, and we are in the process of having made into a plaque to be mounted in the building. So it's great to see so many of you here because tonight is very special, and it's not actually going to be a lecture, but rather a conversation between two profoundly accomplished photographers, Iwan Baan and Gregory Crewdson. Welcome to you both, and to Andre Harwell, whom I think you all know, who is going to moderate tonight's conversation. And of course, welcome to all of our guests, School of Architecture and otherwise. Gregory Crewdson is a professor at the Yale School of Art and is the director of their program in graduate studies in photography, widely noted as the best MFA program in photography in the country. I checked that today, and Google says that's still true. Gregory received his undergraduate degree from SUNY Purchase and his MFA from Yale. And while his early work was the photographs of dioramas that he constructed, he has for now several decades worked with large film set-like teams and sites to photograph existing places, I think with an eye toward their uncanny characteristics. The work is incredible for those of you who know it. His work is in the collection of MoMA, the Whitney, the Brooklyn Museum, among many other museums around the world. And he has shown at the Cleveland Center for Contemporary Art. I picked that randomly out of a long list, White Cube in London, that opening I went to a long time ago, among many, many other galleries and museums in every city you can think of around the world. He is currently represented by the Gagosian Gallery. Gregory has won an NEA Fellowship and the Skowhegan Medal for Photography and is the subject of a 2012 documentary film by Ben Shapiro called Gregory Crewdson, Brief Encounters. He's also a native of Brooklyn and a longtime close friend of mine. I rarely say that in lecture introductions, but he is truly a dear friend, and it gives me especially great pleasure to welcome him to the School of Architecture tonight. Don't clap yet. Iwan Baan is perhaps the most famous architectural photographer working today anywhere in the world. I think everywhere in the world, because he's originally from the Netherlands, but I think, at least based on your Instagram, and I'm one of your, 10 million followers, that you have a life of nonstop global travel. Iwan studied at the Royal Academy of Art in The Hague and has had his work exhibited first and foremost in our gallery here in the school, but in a show he did with Tatiana Bilbao, also at SF MoMA with photographs of Sea Ranch, where I understand your studio went back this year, at the Veitcher Design Museum on the work of the Indian architect Doshi, and currently at the Jewish Museum in New York in an exhibition designed by DSNR on the hair with amber eyes, and that's up, I think, until mid-May. So if you're in New York, I really highly recommend the show. Iwan's work is in more than 80 books. At least I tried to count all the covers on your website. I got to 80, thereabouts. And you have been, I'm staring right at you, have been acknowledged by receiving the first Julius Schulman Photography Award in 2010, the Golden Lion Award at the Venice Architecture Biennale in 2012, and a New York AIA Stephen Clement Oculus Award in 2016, among many others. Iwan has become a friend of the school's and of mine, although a bit more recently than Gregory, and as well as now this semester a member of our faculty, teaching with Tatiana and Andre this semester in their advanced studio. So it's a great pleasure to have you with us this year and tonight. A very quick note on this evening, there'll be the conversation moderated by Andre, there'll be some time for questions, there'll be a reception in the gallery to follow that. So right now, please join me in welcoming two extraordinary photographers. Their work gives us, I think, new insight into how we perceive and understand the built environment. Welcome, Gregory. Welcome, Iwan. Andre, it's all yours.
Thank you so much. So nice. Hello, everyone. Thank you for that really nice introduction. Oops.
Absolutely.
We're going to have some slides here in a second. So the format for today is that I have a few questions prepared, which Iwan and Gregory can choose to answer or dodge or shift however they like. And we have some images from both photographers on a continuous loop behind us, although they're not going to lecture directly to those images. We thought it would be important that you have something to look at while we're talking. And they alternate between each of them. So right now we're looking at some of Gregory's images. So I'm really excited to be here with you guys. Two luminaries in the contemporary photography scene. And I wanted to kick off the discussion with a kind of general question. I think without being hyperbolic, it's fair to say that the world of photography has changed dramatically since each of you entered into the field in the 80s and 90s. While some people have lamented the ease and speed with which today images are produced, reproduced, traded, perhaps stolen, others have hailed this as the kind of democratization of media culture. So at a time when images seem to become totally ubiquitous, they're around us everywhere, what does it mean to you to be a photographer? And is it important to frame your role in one way or another as a defense against, let's say, the legions of Instagrammers who can capture nearly perfect images with their iPhone that they bought yesterday at the Apple store?
I think that's a great way to begin. And I just have to reflect for a moment and say that when I went to school here in the late 1980s, the photo department was actually on this floor. So I'm suffering a kind of flashback anxiety of the brutality of that program. And B19, that's where our crits were, just around the corner here. So truly uncanny in a certain way to be back, and happy to be here. Well, that's the question with photography generally, I think, and always has been. I think maybe more pressing now than ever before is how photography is certainly the currency of our culture. And we all intuitively understand how to read pictures because we're exposed to them on a continuous basis. And now all of us literally are photographers. So there's something very powerful about that like there's a kind of democracy to the medium sort of built in always. But it's also the difficulty, I think, to make pictures that are lasting, that are permanent, that feel that it's part of something deliberate and subjective and artful and meaningful. So I think that the answer to that, I'll answer that question with a certain amount of ambiguity, which I'll answer every question tonight.
Yeah. No, and I think what you're saying, like it's so, what's so great, I think, about it is that we all walk around nowadays with a camera and that we're all getting trained to be much more visual. And I think these questions were always there in a way in photography. When photography was first introduced, people were calling photographers lazy painters. And it's like, that was also a big step from painting to photography, I think. So, and now like, as we see with everything in this world, everything is kind of accelerating, and also that visual culture. So I see it as a great thing, actually.
Do you think of yourselves as photographers first, or do you think of yourselves as artists working in photography as a medium, or something else entirely?
For me, I'm definitely 100% a photographer because ever since I first had my first Photo 1 class and saw the image come up in the developer, you know, I knew the fixed image, an image that is still and quiet with no before or after makes absolute sense to me. I think partially because I'm dyslexic, like many artists, so like narrative forms that evolve in time are generally more difficult for me, you know, and so it's a medium that I really feel like I understand, like the idea of framing a single moment frozen in time. Yeah.
I can totally agree on that part. Like I dabbled in film also a little bit, but I think like that's capturing that moment in time and being present in that moment and keep that moment. I think that's what fascinates me.
It's again, the contradiction here is that I love movies than I more in a certain way than I love still photographs, and have my whole kind of way of making pictures was shaped by cinematic production, and although I'm not quite sure I would know how to make a movie in time, so I like the idea of taking cinematic production and putting it all into a single image. I wouldn't even know how to like go from one image to another because I'm so entirely invested in the single image.
That's a great transition to my next question, which is that I think really in both of your work, narrative plays a leading role. So Iwan, for you as a documentarian, I guess you spend a lot of time, let's say, looking for the story as you trek around the world. While Gregory, you act more like the producer of images, going to great lengths to construct a story in each of your images. How in your creative processes do these narratives emerge, and where do you get your inspiration from?
Yeah, for me, I think like there's a sort of non-stop curiosity I have in the world and in the built environment and how people live and places. So that I think drives me. And then like in terms of my commissioned work, architecture, that's a way like to move around the world and see all these different environments. And for me, that part is maybe the least interesting photography-wise speaking. Like I think I quickly sort of have an idea of when you enter a place of a space in a way, like how you want to photograph it. But then to sort of discover all these other elements there, like what people do there in that place, how they behave, how they take over a place, and also all these sort of unplanned things are for me a big inspiration, and you sort of try to discover these things, and it's really constantly a sort of discovery your own, where I guess for you it's much more that first part of constructing an image, but I don't.
Well, for me, it's, I think, first of all photographers work, no matter how differently they work, they're all chasing something very similar, and that's trying to find some kind of meaning and beauty and mystery in your work. For me, I mean, I really admire what you do because it's such a international scope, and I'm in awe of that. For me, I basically been working in the same towns for like too long, probably, but but I feel like I go sort of deep into a place through that kind of intimacy with a certain knowing every sort of like every street and building. But it all starts with me for location scouting is the key. Location, location, location. That's how it always begins. Me alone, just driving in a car, listening to podcasts, you know. And then looking over and over again at these, sometimes over years, many years, different locations that, and through that process, some kind of story emerges. You mentioned narrative, and I definitely feel that at the core of it, I would call myself a storyteller. Telling a story in a very condensed, very open-ended way. But like, I hope that my pictures in one way or another reveal some kind of story that expresses my own sort of fears and, you know, obsessions and desires, all that. Yeah.
Are those stories more explicit to you in your mind? Like, do you tell yourself the story as you're constructing that image?
No, like I don't really honestly, when I make my pictures, I honestly don't know the meaning of it or like, I just know that like formally and it's just the kind of positions of figures that it just like, it has to remain a mystery to me, you know, otherwise I wouldn't be interested in it, you know, so.
I think that's something we all have as photographers now. Like you find that a sort of mystical moment almost, which you want to keep and share with others.
So it's so interesting because, Gregory, your work is very rooted in a specific locale and a specific cultural milieu, whereas Iwan's is really across the world, going into far-flung locations and interacting with cultures which are very foreign, although I would say you produce a kind of foreignness in your images of towns which are just a few miles away from us here in New Haven. I guess one question I have is whether you feel you have any responsibility to the places and the people you're representing, whether they're real or imagined.
Yeah, very much so. I love the places that I photograph, and I want to make them as beautiful and I guess transcendent as possible. Like I don't think I could make the pictures I make without like feeling deeply about it. Like it's, I do think that making pictures is some kind of act of love, but like from a separated viewpoint. I mean, that to me, that's another key thing. I think that all photographers must feel, I would imagine, is like, no matter how close you feel to the thing, you're always separated from it. You're always slightly detached or removed just by the very act of putting a camera to your eye is an exact act of separation, you know. So for me, it's that like necessary alienation, but also something deeply felt, the two. Again, the ambiguity.
I'm fascinated with your work in a way that it's also like that, like you're so rooted in the Berkshires,
Yes.
and all your work plays out there. And we figured out last week that we live actually 15 minutes away from each other.
This was very, talking about uncanny. Yeah. To tell the story, we just bumped into each other in a random park.
Trying to get our two kids out of the playground screaming, and you pull up.
I was on my way for a walk, and it's like, that's exactly what it is, you know, the uncanny, like the unexpected in the familiar.
Yeah,
You know?
and I can totally see also why you're in that area. That's also what attracted me to that
Yeah.
area. But it's also like with my work, it's kind of the opposite. I get also like an incredible energy of all the sort of total polar opposites you sort of encounter sometimes within a week span, and how completely present and open you are because of that, like things, such totally unusual, different spaces you enter all the time, that I think that's sort of, yeah, a presence and openness for these new moments are, for me, a big part of the work, and how I see and capture these moments. For you, it's like really this endless planning, I feel like.
Yeah, but I still say at the core, it's something like you're trying to uncover that's, you know, remains, you know, there's some draw to it, and it's also photography. The camera is like an alibi in a certain way. It allows you into places. It gives you license to be in places you ordinarily wouldn't
Having
be able
traveled
to.
with Iwan, I'm aware of that.
Yeah.
He's amazing at getting you in anywhere he wants to be.
Yeah, yeah.
The camera is always the best excuse to come into places and where you don't really belong otherwise. And, that's,
So, you know, light also plays a really critical role in each of your work, obviously. Gregory, your images are often portraying the kind of hinge point between day and night, either at dawn or at dusk. And Iwan, your most recent book, Momentum of Light, considers this stark contrast between the midday and the midnight sun in sub-Saharan Africa. And I think you've gone so far as to actually print the dark images on black paper so that they kind of emerge from the darkness. As the main medium of photography, what role does light play not only in your process, but in the way that you tell these stories? Why is it important? And who is it that's influenced you in the way that you manage light in your images?
yeah, for me, like I'm only working with the existing light in a place.
Only?
Only, I can never work
Yeah,
with
but I'm
artificial.
saying that's not only, that's
Like, that's
everything.
not insubstantial. It's just the sun.
Exactly. Or what an architect has imagined, or
Right.
like just basically, yeah, deal with what you have there, and also like the weather and the circumstances. And I think like you try to push that always to the sort of extremes also. Like it's easy like to make a kind of nice image. What you in the architecture fields is like. I feel always like in the architecture field, architecture is always portrayed in like the golden hour in the sunset, so which I find incredibly boring. But it's like, so you try to push it to like all these extremes. I think like sometimes, yeah, in the pouring rain or like in the middle of the night, like the shot I did of New York, for instance, during the blackout.
What's your favorite kind of light generally to shoot in? Like if you...
It's hard to say. I think it's really a sort of a moment where everything has to line up, and that can be like middle of the day or middle of the night or anywhere in between. And it's sort of, I feel always it's this kind of puzzle you're looking for, working with the camera and being in a place, see what people do there, what light does there, the weather conditions, and yeah, the book you mentioned, like I try to push that in an extreme way, that yeah, photographing these interiors of these villages in Burkina Faso, which are all thick mud walls, like these houses are built in a way like everything is trying to keep the light and thus the heat basically out. So they're basically, and you come from the outside where it's like a harsh 90-degree sun. You come inside and the first 5 minutes you don't see anything, and your eyes have to adapt and to play with that notion. And then you try to use a technology also, like sort of in the most extreme ways. That these cameras become incredibly light sensitive, so you can start to uncover things which you couldn't really do before. Or the image of New York, Manhattan during Sandy, and like I went up in a helicopter in a moment that they're in the middle of the night. I want to try to capture that moment where there's basically no light, and you try to work with sort of all these extremes in a way, and at the same time light is kind of the main ingredient for photography. But
I've never been in a helicopter.
Maybe it's time.
come next time with me.
That's a hint.
Totally.
For me, light is everything. You know, it's like because because I'm interested in storytelling, and because at the very least you could tell just like a very limited story. There's no dialogue. There's no movement in time. Light is like from a narrative code. It's how to tell a story. It's through light, and that's why I go through such enormous efforts with I have a director of photography who I work very closely, Rick Sands. We've been working for like 25, 30 years now, and so that's at the core of it. It's a way of creating the world. It's a way of telling the story. It's the way of creating the sensibility of your aesthetic. You know, it's the thing that gives form to your inner story.
It's interesting. I think the way both of you use light is highly enabled by revolutions in digital technologies. Yeah. Gregory, I remember you lectured actually in this room maybe 15 years ago and described your process of digital compositing of multiple negatives where you'd turn different lights on, use different strobe kits, and then bring things up and down. And Iwan, you've mentioned the fact that this new generation of cameras that are mirrorless has allowed you to basically take photographs in the middle of the night where only the stars are shining. Yeah. What other ways have technology changed your practice over the years? Are there other important things that we should understand?
Photography is a technological medium at its core, so like that is always in flux and always changing. There are always new tools. You know, when I first made like early pictures like that, I was working with 8x10 film, and would shoot many frames of negatives and composite them. Now we work exclusively digitally, and you know, we couldn't even see the image because there was no monitor or anything. But in the end, it's really all in service of the vision that you're trying to create. So it can never just be the technical aspect. Should never ever be just for its own, just purely for its own expression. It has to be like connected to some kind of way of looking at the world.
Yeah. No, I think for me, like, when I was in art school, like my interest was much more in documentary photography, and I did that for a couple of years after art school, and it was that strange moment, like in 2004, 2005, when I met Rem, what suddenly brought me into the whole architecture field, completely unexpected. But
is that how it happened?
Yeah.
Wow, interesting.
But it was also, I feel like a moment, like, so I was always photographing. Like I built actually when I was 16 years old, my first 4x5-inch view camera and the whole thing. So I was interested in all
the studio.
So I was interested in all these technological things in a way, but I liked always photographing much more handheld, and it's still what I do. But I feel at that moment when I met Rem, like I was also sort of ready for a change, and also like technological in a way. Like until that time, sort of architectural photography, I still don't consider myself an architectural photographer, but it's like it was always like the big view camera and everything completely straight and framed and so. And I think at that moment also it was a moment that digital was far enough that you actually could do all these things. So like I was kind of ready for it. Technology was kind of ready for it, and yeah, it fascinated me to also totally what the office there was doing, and so kind of all these things lined up in a way that what brought me into this field.
One other thought about this is in terms of post-production, you know, printing and everything. It used to be when I was, you know, early on in my career, we were like very dependent on big photo labs, you know, and you'd have to, you know, go to these like very corporate spaces and deal with like all these like strangers and trying to make your art. And now, because of just the nature of how things have become more accessible with Epson printers and everything can be done on your own. So there's a very different kind of deliberate process to that where you could really, it's a much more engaged and personal and, you know, process. Post-production is very important for me in terms of the work, because as I said 15 years ago, I do composite a lot and all that in the printing process.
Amazing. You know, perhaps not unlike the mythical image of the solo architect, the mythical image of the photographer is this sort of lone artist toting his camera through the woods, think Ansel Adams, trying to capture some essential composition. But in fact, for both of you, collaboration plays a pretty strong role in your work. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, for me, I think the collaboration is with the architects I work with, which open very different worlds all the time to me, and I feel like that's both for the commissioned work, but also with my own interest, my own produced work, like that's also kind of stemming out of these things, and the connections you make, the people you meet, the stories you hear, which bring you in all these different places. Like maybe one example, I think there's some images in here, like the Ise Shrine in Japan, that is this incredible site which gets rebuilt already for 1400 years, every 20 years. And it's this whole process. And that was one of the things, like, because I work with so many Japanese architects, they were always saying, like, you have to visit the Ise Shrine. It's kind of the golden ratio for Japanese architecture in a way. And then, like, they brought me in there, and then another project evolves out of there. So these kind of collaborations are very important. And I think for you, it's also really the making of, no?
Yeah, still though, there is that element of like the lone sort of figure, you know, or the lone photographer. There is something to that. You know, as I mentioned, like the location scouting is a very kind of isolated act. But then I have a very large team that comes on board for our production. We work like movies in a way, so we work in like 6-week periods, and my director of photography, my line producer, location managers, all that, you know, art department, and but we're all sort of working together to try to create like these singular perfect moments. That's the idea anyway. And at this point, I've been working with most of them so many years now that there's a shorthand that there isn't a lot of conversation that needs to happen because we all kind of know what we're after.
Like an old school movie studio where
Yeah.
the employees were more permanent rather
Yeah.
than being on a project basis.
Yeah, because like you really do have to. I have to because I'm not particularly good at any of it. You know, I have that vision and in my head, and I just surround myself with people who could help achieve that, and so that's been really wonderful part of the whole thing. But after that, it goes back just me in the studio. So like there is a kind of loop to it.
So I just have a couple more questions before we move into audience questions. And these are really more about how you understand your position, relative to, let's say, the art market. Iwan, your work is always blended commissioned commercial work, let's say for architects, with more editorial work and collaborations on publications. While Gregory, your work has been exhibited, published in book form, obviously, and has fetched substantial sums at auction. How does the market for images play a role in your work, if it does? And how do you think about the meaning of your images being co-opted by market forces? Is that important to you? And is it important to think about how your images might ultimately be used and whether you can control that or not?
It's obviously things you think about. You try not to really, because you really, when you're making the picture, your sort of only focus is making the picture, and then while you're working in the in post-production, it's a very private thing, and then every few years, like in my case, it's 2, 3, 4 years, I'll have a show, and then that's very public. And then there's that, and that's just part of, and then the pictures enter into the world through a gallery system or books or whatever it is, and you necessarily have to, that's when you sort of lose ownership of them in a certain way because they become part of the public. You hope anyway that there's an audience for it, and you hope that they will connect to people. And then you can't really control how they exist in the world, but that's just part of the faith of being an artist. And then the cycle continues, and then you're back, trying to make a picture again. Like nothing else really changes after that. It's like same problems. Different problems? I don't know.
Yeah, for me, I haven't been so active yet in the art field, but like it's for me my commissioned work for architects. It's just a part of the work which kind of enables also me to do the other work, which I find interesting. It still deals with the built environment, but in very different ways, and like the informal places, in the self-built places, the vernacular types. And I think to look at that full spectrum, I find it fascinating, and I approach all these things in exactly the same way also. Like if it's locally I'm able with the commissioned work to say no also to most projects. So it's like you pick out the projects which in a way like where it still can tell my story, which I try to do in these places. It's also with that other part of the other sort of extreme of these self-built places, the informal and so on. Like it's still like how people create a place for themselves. These kind of things fascinate me a lot, and I think the commissioned work is just like a way to.
Do you have to love the architecture that you like? Do you have to feel connected to it, or can you
No, not especially. No, like the architecture is not immediately the thing. I think the thing what drives me really is like the context and the location, and if there's another story to tell around it. So sometimes it's the total juxtaposition of these things, or which make it interesting, or so. I don't have to be in total love with the architecture, but I think that other story is there to tell. That's for me very important.
What's the best part and the worst part for you? I'm taking over.
Please.
Yeah. The best part and the worst part. I think like in the very beginning, like there were some of the commissioned works where like architects try to take over, and like they think they've been working totally. That's the strange thing. Like they've been working for 5 years, 8 years, 10 years on a project. They think they know it all. They planned every inch of it, and they want you to basically photograph it what they have in mind. But I think the much more interesting is to have this outsider eye of someone who doesn't have any knowledge of that project, and really can tell a sort of different story. And that's what I try to do with every place I come, like what inspires me of that place. And the architecture is, in that sense, is just the background of that other story you try to tell.
It's interesting because earlier you said you still don't describe yourself as an architectural photographer, but I think there's a case to be made that you, like Ezra Stoller and some others before you, are defining the way that we see a generation's worth of architecture. And so I guess that leads me to my next question, which is that I think it'd be fair to say that both of you have achieved a pretty substantial level of, let's say, fame as a result of your practices. What does that fame mean to you or to your work? And what does it imply? For instance, power, responsibility, the need to hide, et cetera.
Definitely the need to hide.
That's why we both ended up in the Berkshires.
Is that self-evident? It never feels that way. It just feels like you're a working artist and you're just confronted each day with problems, and then there are like these moments of grace where it all, for that brief moment, when you're making a picture and you see it in front of you, there's this moment where the world makes sense. That's all. And so that's the best part for me, and the worst part is everything else.
Exactly.
That's the answer. Any thoughts, Iwan?
No, I don't know.
I read an account
don't
where you said
consider
you
that.
stopped posting on Instagram where you were. I read an account where you were talking about posting your location on Instagram being a problem because people would come and like seek you out.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, sometimes I post a little bit later than that I'm actually there. But no, I don't know. I don't consider that really. You're just trying to
Working photographers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So last question. What do you hope those who experience your work will take away from it?
It's a really good question. And for me, it's like that's really the most beautiful part when it happens, like if somebody brings their own story to it and is drawn to it in a way that is, their own version of things. Like I have an idea of what a picture might mean, but and that's, I think every artist has like the ambition, I think, to make work that feels singular and generates meaning and relevancy to a larger culture. It's what we all hope for.
Yeah. Yeah, I think for me, it's also showing this incredible wide variety of how people live in the world and create a place for themselves, and how these things which we all take for granted can be completely polar opposite somewhere else, and bring it all together in in a sort of collection I feel like I'm making. But and then it's these moments you try to find which really transcend and can transform that moment to a viewer.
I want to thank you both for indulging my questions, and
Great questions, actually.
thank you.
Yeah.
Maybe we could bring the house lights up and have some questions from the audience.
It's so nice not to be on Zoom, I have to say.
I know.
It's like, I'm just sort of startling to see actual
three-dimensional
faces.
space.
I know, not in boxes, I don't get.
Are there questions?
There's a
In
couple.
the back, with the blue mask.
The blue map. Yeah.
Hello? Oh, hi. I was wondering, what are your considerations for both of you around time when it comes to these photographs? I know that usually it's all about capturing the essence of this specific moment, but on a larger scale, like, do you try to approach capturing like a period of time and era? I feel like with Gregory, some of your photographs, there's a sense of timelessness because of the lack of landmarks. But also at the same time, in some of your photographs, you've got like very specific older models of cars and vintage cars that really mark them in a way. So I was wondering, like, what are your thoughts about time in general?
It's a good question. For me, I guess another contradiction is like, I want the pictures to feel outside of time, you know, like, definitely not a time, like a period piece, you know, like it should feel sort of strangely familiar and outside of time, like every part of it, like the architecture, the cars, the figures, like, I wanted it all to feel very familiar, but sort of like hard to locate specifically in terms of like where we are. And I can't quite tell you why. I go through, every year it becomes harder and harder to find those cars, I'll say. You know, they're all, we find them like, you know, we have interns like driving around and, but
Are you taking applications? 'Cause
yes.
I bet there's a few in the audience who'd like to help you with
So, but, and I try to, you know, I don't quite understand why, but like, it's probably because those were the cars that are in the photographs that I really admired coming of age, like Stephen Shore and Joel Sternfeld and Arbus and all those, that whole generation. And so like, you know, you're kind of working through this thing of, that's what artists do, is like you absorb tradition, like conventions of other people's work, and you then try to reinvent it by one degree and make it your own. That's what we all try to do, I think.
Nice. Yeah. No, I think for me, maybe it's a bit the opposite. I really try to capture a very specific moment in time and put it in the here and now. And that was the strange thing when I started working with architects and was really looking a bit more into architectural photography, where it was always, they tried to create this totally timeless, like cut-out frame, a building without any context, without people, without fashion, without cars, and all these things. But I think, like, for me, it's all about that specific moment in time that I'm there, and I capture that moment and see that moment, and also move on to the next place. And so I try to use very much, all these specific cues, sort of time, of a period, of a culture, of the context, and all these things, which really dated to a specific moment.
I have a question for Iwan about aerial photography and what it conveys to you at this historical moment. I ask because it's something that, of course, we encounter a lot when we look at the early 20th century photography. It's kind of an obsession, a recurring format. So what does it mean for you and today?
Yeah, for me, like, I got hooked to aerial photography. Was a strange moment. It was quite a long time before I was working with architects. It was 2 days before 9/11, and it was a completely a commercial job I had in New York, doing aerial shots of New York and the World Trade Center. And
Helicopter
everything.
again.
Helicopter. And then flew back to Amsterdam, and then there was no World Trade Center anymore.
Oh, God.
So that was very strange.
Oh,
but
God.
then I started working with architects, and I was like, there were two things which really became apparent for me. Like, it's a strange thing. Like, architects, they in all their drawings, their renderings, they're always populated with people and always in the perfect locations and so on. But then the pictures were always devoid of that. But then also, like, they make beautiful models, site models, where the building is in the context in the city, and that view was also never really represented. So I felt like it was always, for me, a very important tool to, that constant zooming in and out. Like, I'm fascinated by how people live in that space, how they take it over and make it something of their own, but also like that other extreme where the building almost disappears in really the context and the sea of the city, and how the city around it is formed, how a project like for the commissioned work, how a project really fits in that context and makes part of it or is juxtaposed, or just how these very specific cities are formed and how they're all unique. So I think that bird's eye perspective is a very important part of my visual language, of that kind of zooming in and out.
Gregory,
Yeah.
Sort of mysterious, unspoken drama, I feel, going on. And of course, it reminds me of one of my favorite painters, Edward Hopper. And I'm just wondering if there's a sort of, if you make a relationship to Hopper.
Yeah, well, I always said he's the greatest photographer. Of course, I feel deeply connected to the use of light and vernacular spaces and kind of loneliness of the work. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, thank you for your discussion. I have 2 questions. The first one is, what's your favorite way of distributing or like publishing your photos, whether it be like in a book or in a gallery or online, or like, I guess, how much value is associated with the dissemination? And the second question is, if it's not for commission work or work related, what kind of photos do you enjoy taking?
Yeah. Start with that one?
For me, I think like I love making books, and like also it's a big part, sort of the sequence of images, which I try to put together. What comes before and after, and it's the same with exhibitions, I think. But in the end, like the kind of physical object of of a book or of a print or so. That's what I try to do.
Is that because your work tends to have some kind of seriality, and putting it in a book allows you to organize?
It's I think like it's also like telling that sort of visual story of a place, and that lends itself, I feel, very much to like the sequence of a book.
Well, I'd say like 99.9% of the population sees pictures online or on screens or on phones. And so like those of us who still actually make physical prints that hang on walls, it's like increasingly challenging, and I'll include myself in that, like where I experience most pictures mediated through some screen or another, but there's nothing like, I think, the being confronted with an image that's been printed a certain scale for a particular audience. You know, that's like that. I don't think that will, it's becoming more and more rare, but I think that will never really change. And in terms of making, I'm not a natural photographer, I have to say that. Like, I never have a, you know, even on a cell phone, it's very rare that I actually will make a picture. I have to remind myself to take pictures of like my family and stuff. Yeah.
I think we probably have time for one or two more questions.
Okay.
Maybe somebody in the gallery here?
All right, this is maybe a little bit long-winded, but for some context, I was lucky enough to speak with James Nachtwey a couple years ago, and I asked him about the intentions that he had for photography, and whether he went into it with the idea that, whether he had an idea of the story he wanted to tell or a narrative that he had to link everything together. And he responded that it wasn't really about what a photo tells you, but rather, so like it's not focused on the conventional narrative of sorts, but rather what a photo asks of you. So in your response about showing how people live and revealing the realities of the world and your world, I was wondering if you're aiming to tell a story or ask a question, or is it something else entirely?
For those of you who don't know, James Nachtwey is like a world-renowned war photographer, so that's kind of relevant to the moment, but like, now that's something I can never imagine, like in so many different levels, working in that context for good. But you know, that's a whole nother. I don't know if I'm answering your questions, but it brings up a lot of interesting questions about representation and conflict and the role of journalism and particularly in like the social media era. So, but truly amazing figure in terms of like negotiating all that.
I don't know. For me, I think like asking questions from the viewer is a great way, I think, to you want to show something, but you also want to keep it open and have a place for interpretation of your work by the viewer. And I think in my case, like these very different circumstances of where people live under and create places for themselves, I think that does open a lot of questions for the viewer, where we all take so many things of our built environment or the way we live or so for granted. And I think to open that completely up and show all these other possibilities and what's normal for us. I think that is a big drive. Yeah.
Well, I think we should offer our guests a round of applause and bring it to a close.
Thank you, Deborah. Turn off the microphone.